This week on To the Contrary.
First, why more women are turning against gun control laws. Then, are corporate diversity policies just a ruse? Behind the headlines, learning to forgive even the most outrageous criminals.
Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, gun control.
Women have been the core support for gun control laws for decades. Is that changing? According to a National Shooting Sports Foundation survey, more than one-third of women who own guns bought their first recently. The National Rifle Association reports the number of women who owned firearms rose by almost 80% between 2004 and 2011. As women's gun ownership rises, polls show they oppose gun control at higher levels. Gun control advocates say the change comes because the issue has lost visibility in the media.
So, Congresswoman Norton, what exactly is propelling this change?
I tell you, Bonnie, unless they're going to be fast on the draw against their domestic abusers, I'm not sure it's going to help women. They are 5 times more likely to die with guns in the home.
I'm not surprised at all. Women are astronauts, they're Supreme Court justices, they're surgeons. Why not, be able to defend yourself?
I'm at a loss for words on this one, which is unusual for me, as we know. I think if we look at political information, women are very concerned about safety and security. So I suspect that's what's underneath this.
I think gun ownership is continuing to increase, especially over the past 5 years, because of the slippery slope that a lot of women and other members of the gun sort of lobby feel strongly about with respect to President Obama's effort to sort of curtail their potential Second Amendment rights.
Well, but first of all, we should mention that there really has been a dearth of data, the kind of data you cited, because Republicans in Congress at some point, you fill me in, please, but they made it impossible for the Centers for Disease Control to collect data on gun ownership. But when there was a lot of it out there, it was more commonly known that the use of a firearm was the keeping of a firearm in the house was much more likely to result in a homicide, as we saw, for example, with Adam Lanza, or suicide than any other kind of situation.
60% of guns in the home go for suicides. Domestic abuse, there are only, I think, about 10 states that say if you have been found guilty of domestic abuse, you can't have a gun. That means in most states you can have a gun even after domestic abuse. I suspect women, precisely because they don't know the kinds of things this program is about, suspect that they will be defending themselves. They live in homes increasingly where men have guns, and if everybody around you has a gun, then you want a gun, and look at the circle we are. You're going to end up shooting at your neighbor or someone friendly, not at some intruder who you would have to get a fast draw on to do something about.
I think we could disagree with whether or not people ought to own guns, but the sort of underlying reasons why women may be choosing to buy guns now is, I think, a sign of just how insecure so many people feel, right? We have an economy that is still sort of sputtering along. We have political vitriol on both sides that I think makes people very uncomfortable. And we have foreign policy.
And we have daily mass shootings where...
We have mass shootings, and we have people worry about something like Paris or San Bernardino happening in their backyard. And so I don't think
forget about Paris or San Bernardino. I mean, just talk about Columbine, all the local crazies who get guns of mass destruction and go out into a movie theater and kill a bunch of people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of women, and especially perhaps I would be interested to see the numbers. I wonder if it's higher among mothers, feel that they may be able to protect their family.
Well, it actually is. It's very interesting to me. It's higher among Southerners. Mm-hmm. So we're talking Bible Belt. we're probably talking large sections of the least educated part of the country, and it's way higher among Republicans than Democrats.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you go down the list of all the things that Gallup sorted by gender, by region, by race, etc., persons of color and Democrats are the only ones who still think it's safer not to have a weapon in your house. Explain that, or you explain that for me.
Sabrina, you talked about motherhood, right? Well, the statistics around what happens to children when there's a gun in the home is the most disturbing statistics that exist. And so I think, to your point, Congresswoman, there is a dearth of information and reminder. For example, would we all be wearing seatbelts today if there wasn't that enormous campaign about the safety issues?
Well, forget that. It's the chime that goes off in your car if you don't put the seatbelt on.
I'm old enough to remember when they weren't mandatory, right? I remember that. So there's a dearth. I think Congresswoman hit the nail on the head. There's a dearth of information. When I've got a Republican young woman mother who's a friend of mine saying that she's going to get a gun to protect herself from being assaulted when she's out jogging, I know we've got a problem here. Because I'm like, honey, if you put that gun in your home, do you know what the chances are that your child will find the gun and shoot themselves are?
There's
She's
also
like,
lots of technology to keep people safe.
I'm sorry, the statistics speak for themselves when it comes to what happened to children when there's a gun in the home. It is unequivocal.
That might be the case, but we may be more productive in our conversation, as I think it's clear that gun ownership is going up. If we want to actually keep people safe, then we were better off talking about the technology to help keep them safe.
Right, but doesn't the NRA oppose, like if you have to punch in a code, or if you have to do your fingerprint, or however you need to give a biomarker for the gun to start working, the NRA is opposed to having those things because it makes it a little less quick that you get access to the gun.
I don't know exactly an official NRA statement, but I do know plenty of people with guns who believe in sort of securely keeping guns in a home. And so I do think that, it's clear that we have a culture in America where people want their Second Amendment right, and I think it might be more productive to figure out how to keep people safe rather than take them away.
I agree with that. I think a big part of this, and whether you're talking about women or people who are gun owners, is reactionary. You're seeing the number of gun owners increase over the past couple of years because of things like Gabby Giffords, because of Sandy Hook, because people see this groundswell of congressional and legislative and even the president's executive action taking place. They're seeing a concern that their Second Amendment rights could be eroded, and so because of that, they're running out and buying guns in any way possible. Now, whether or not they're keeping them in the home or they're using them to protect their families or their children remains to be seen. But I think my bigger question is, in this dialogue we're having here, what you find is that we have to be talking about what the real solution is to this problem. Are we trying to address a problem of mass shootings? Are we trying to address a problem of gun ownership? Does our country have too many guns? We have 310 million guns in this country. Is that what the goal of policies that are in place are, right? Are we trying to get rid of guns, or are we trying to address a problem, which is that we're worried about mass shootings, and how do we prevent that? Is that mental health funding? Is that threat assessments? What are we trying to do to address that problem, not removing people's ability to have access to guns?
Can we just have general information out there about what happens when guns are around? And that's what the Congresswoman's talking about. I think it's the most fundamental issue.
Well, but will that change if
what you don't know is hurting you? And the government won't do it because the government is blocked by the NRA from doing it. But there are foundations out there who could really be helpful, because nobody will keep them from getting that information out there, and they need to do it, and they need to do it fast. Otherwise, this gun thing is now a vicious circle, and it is out of our control virtually.
Well, and that's a question I have to you, too, which is, with more weapons than people in this country circulating, gun control becomes meaningless, doesn't it? I mean, you can pass a law. It doesn't mean there's so many out there now.
Not if you're talking about background checks, because now we still have 90%. The Republicans are 88%. Democrats are a little more than that, who say we want at least background checks on people before they own a gun.
Right.
But we have that in
cannot get that through the Congress of the United States.
Right, but how many of these guns, even with or without background checks, that are used for mass shootings?
60% get no background checks.
Okay, but how many of the, and I don't know the answer to this question, but maybe there is an answer out there. What percentage of the guns that are used by the guy from, I guess it was Colorado, who shot up the Planned Parenthood clinic, the San Bernardino
Here's
people,
where the president's response is right.
But wait a second. are purchased illegally, meaning that there would be weapons out on the black market, so many of them that it really wouldn't matter what kind of,
it would matter.
Laws
It would
Congress
matter.
passed.
They've shown that something like 2 or 3 million people have been kept from buying guns just because there are some background checks out there. And look, here the president is right. He's saying, we're not saying you're going to solve this problem. We understand how many guns are out there, but if you rein this problem in, you are doing something. We should not be throwing our hands out and saying this thing is out of control, there's nothing we can do about it. That's not the American way.
Yeah, I agree with you, Congresswoman. I think that one of the things that we all can do better is to identify when something doesn't seem right, and that seems to be the common thread with all of these mass shootings, is that when something doesn't seem right, people aren't speaking up. And why they're not speaking up may be just a human instinct not to want to point fingers at somebody who's not actually doing something. But in the case of the San Bernardino terrorist attack, or whether we're talking about Sandy Hook, in both cases, in those instances, people felt that something was wrong and they didn't say anything.
All right. Well, if you see something, say something. Whether people are doing that, more people should. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay. From guns to diversity.
Most large American companies set up diversity programs and policies as a way of combating bias in the workplace. But do they work? Research published in the Harvard Business Review suggests the programs do not and might actually be counterproductive. Researchers report the most commonly used diversity programs do not result in an increase of women and minorities in more high-level corporate jobs. In fact, one study of 700 American companies found a decrease in the representation of black women. Using hiring simulations, researchers found white men who applied for jobs with companies that promote their anti-discrimination policies believed they would be treated unfairly and be less valued. Researchers note companies succeed in defending gender discrimination allegations by pointing to their anti-discrimination policies.
So, Sabrina Schaeffer, are these corporate diversity policies just a ruse to get away with continuing to discrimination, but to discriminate in terms of hiring and promotion, and yet waive this policy in the face of a courtroom should they be sued for discrimination?
No, I mean, look, I think that this has sort of gone a little bit awry. I think that there's perhaps the intentions for most companies are that they want to show that they are, have a diverse employee population and that they are socially responsible, and so it may not all be genuine. But I think that the premise of this whole study is that all employers are bad, that no employers want diversity or see the value of bringing women or minorities onto their staff. And I think that that's sort of misleading. I think that most people recognize that African Americans, that Latinos, that Asians, that women, they bring something important to the table, and that to the extent that it works for their business model, they want that diversity without government, without a policy in place.
And I agree with you 100%, Sabrina. I think this is a situation where, with the best of intentions, corporations have put these in. Have they been driven by liability concerns? Of course they have. But a lot of good intentions there. But I think that what's underneath it is not enough yet, right? There has to be more practices, hiring practices, that allow people to bring in more diversity. And I think that's we're not there yet.
Could I say something about this liability concern? Please don't take the Walmart case, which is a case where they held up the fact that they had a broad policy. It was because the case was too broad. Virtually every woman had sued, and when you have, it's very hard to have a class action. That's what it was. As you know, I chaired the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and I will concede that some of this is about liability. But I really do agree with you, Sabrina. I think they thought it was a good thing to do. Here's why research is so important. We talked about research on guns. Here's where we now get feedback. And the negative effect it has on white men, that was shocking to me. They would never say that out. Why in the world has it, or did it, result in hiring fewer black women? Now we need to understand what is the true meaning of these facts and figures that we know for the first time and that are contraindicated.
Well, I think the vast majority of Fortune 100 companies have these types of programs in place now, which I think is reassuring. But I think,
and what the public doesn't know, and what I really want to point out to viewers, is there's an industry around diversity, and inclusion in the corporate world. Yeah. There are huge conferences. Millions of dollars are spent promoting. Here's our African American or Latina who heads our diversity division, and here are our policies. And yet you look, you see women in HR, you see women in public relations, you don't see women in bottom line jobs, you don't see minorities in bottom line jobs. And I have gone to these events, and it's just an incredible amount of showing off, really. And I feel very sad seeing this Harvard Business Review article saying that, hey, wait a minute, it's also not having the desired results.
Right, and we're seeing that some companies take it more seriously than others. I think some companies have good intentions with respect to senior management taking an active role in supporting these types of programs. I think largely they're misunderstood, but at the end of the day, what you're finding is that these programs are responding to the changing demographics that a lot of companies are facing. They have to adapt. They have to look at what Sabrina was talking about with respect not only to women, but with respect to minorities and people of different faiths and cultures, because they're trying to sell a product. They're trying to represent a constituency. In order to be effective at that in this changing economy, they have to find a way to adapt to the demographics.
Think about it. It's a market-crazed society. Put an ad up, that'll solve your problem. There is an answer to this. The CEO has to get beyond the ad. He's got to get people who go out and do the job. For example, you want to hire blacks, why don't you send people to recruit at historically black colleges and universities. We have Howard University right here in D.C. Why don't you send them to the Ivy League and say, don't just give me your white students. Surely you have some women and some minorities that I ought to be talking to. This is action over ads. And I believe that is the lesson of this advertising approach to diversity.
Congresswoman, I've had the pleasure of working with two. One was the CEO of the largest commercial real estate firm in the world. And I had the pleasure of working with him closely, a gentleman named Glenn Rafrano, and then another man, Bill Levins, who was the COO of one of the large utility companies that services in New York City. These men were inordinately dedicated to exactly what the Congresswoman is talking about. It's exactly what it takes. It takes bottom up, inside, and top down, saying, listen, we're going to make this happen.
But we also want to make sure that we allow businesses to have the freedom and the flexibility to hire the people that make sense for their company. I mean, the reality is I was never much of a great science student. I just didn't love it as much as some of the other people I knew, and plenty of them were girls. But I probably would be a terrible coder, right? I mean, perhaps my daughters will be different. But I think we have to sort of allow certain industries to say, you know what, we have an overrepresentation perhaps of men or of Asians or whatever the group is. We can't just eliminate that. We have to allow them to sort of find a balance that works for them so that we don't stifle economic growth, stifle job creation, stifle innovation in the name of diversity. So I think there's a balancing act there.
But we're not there yet. We have a lot of work to do.
We're not there yet.
Nobody says hire unqualified women in order to meet your quota. Quotas are illegal in the United States.
But that network is important, that ability for companies to partner with HBCUs or partner with organizations that can provide that additional support for diversity rather than just having hiring practices that are like, I'm hiring this person or I'm hiring that person.
Right. And I would say in the green room, Jen, you said something that was really powerful. We hire people, research shows, that look like us, that are like us. So, so I think that's part of this too, right? You have to have systemic practices in place to overcome that.
That's absolutely part of
the
this.
problem.
And I just went, in preparation for this discussion, I went and called up Automotive Review, one of the online automotive industry review magazines, and I looked at all the top automotive industries for international car, not GM and Ford, but the international automakers, and it was so far behind in terms of having women in executive positions from where it was 10 or 20 years ago. It shocked me, and I do think there was this push of go for diversity, and it has receded, and there needs to be another one. It was just amazing to me what I saw. Absolutely. Behind the headlines, the complex concept of forgiveness. Most people are amazed when a victim forgives a criminal who has harmed them or a loved one. Take, for example, the family members of those killed in the South Carolina church shooting. We spoke with a journalist who researched forgiveness and its impact on the person who forgives.
Forgiving, it doesn't mean condoning someone. It doesn't mean condoning an action, right? It doesn't mean oh yes, he was right when he did that. The families who forgave in Charleston, they weren't asking that Dylan Roof be freed. You can have forgiveness and justice. They're not mutually exclusive.
Journalist Megan Feldman Betancourt wrote Triumph of the Heart, Forgiveness in an Unforgiving World. Her inspiration for studying forgiveness was Azim Khamisa.
Azim forgave the man who killed his son, and not only did he forgive him, he actually reached out to the family of this man who had killed his son, and they became very close friends, and they actually started a nonviolence education organization together that does work in at-risk schools to prevent violence.
Feldman Betancourt says as a grudge holder, she needed to understand how some people could actually forgive, so she started researching the science and interviewing families.
I talked with the family of Rachel Scott in Colorado, and Rachel was one of the first victims of the Columbine shooting. They, as well as other people in the book, and the Charleston families, they forgave. And what's interesting is that they talked about it as kind of a survival response. Like, on some level, they knew that if they didn't forgive, they would remain just mired in this anger and bitterness and really not be able to have any sort of decent health or good life.
But can the process of forgiveness be applied to everyday situations? There are plans to use it to change the culture at schools with violence problems.
Rhonda Raquetta, the principal at City Springs School in Baltimore City, she attended this class about restorative practices. They started using these circles, and everyone takes turns holding a talking stick and sharing basically his or her version of what happened. And not only that, their thoughts and feelings about what happened and their ideas for how to resolve it. In 5 years, they actually reduced suspensions by between 78 and 80%, and they nearly eradicated fighting.
Betancourt says this model has also shown promise for bridging cultural divides.
I had the opportunity to visit a summer camp that brings Israeli teens and Palestinian teens together. And I had one Israeli young woman say to me, I came here ready to shoot a fact like an arrow at any Arab. And then when I when I started talking with these Arab women, I realized that I had no idea what was happening on the other side.
Betancourt claims the science around forgiveness is building. She says forgiveness is as innate as revenge, and how one deals with it is determined by institutions and one's environment. The science also says forgiveness can have physical health benefits for whomever practices it.
There's multiple studies that show that forgiveness can actually put you less at risk and actually in some cases alleviate depression and anxiety. And in terms of heart health, there's been studies that show cardiac patients who receive therapy that includes a forgiveness component as opposed to just nutritional counseling, their blood flow increases to their heart, whereas the control group did not. And then in terms of the brain, just the act of considering, thinking about whether or not someone should be forgiven, activates the part of the brain that's concerned with problem solving and empathy, as opposed to the amygdala, which is involved in the fight or flight response.
Betancourt says scientists have found forgiveness can be learned. What would the world look like if forgiveness became a major factor in solving conflict around the world?
I would like people to learn more about these restorative practices and the ways that we can actually foster the seeking and granting of forgiveness in our communities, because it would, if we did that, our world would be radically different.
So I think most thinking people realize it's easier on yourself to forgive, but because of the stress, because of the anxiety, because you're not wasting time thinking about somebody who did something horrible to you that can't be undone. But how do you get from the normal and natural feelings of hate against somebody who harmed you or a loved one to forgiving them?
Well, I've been very honest on this wonderful show, Bonnie, that my passion, my unrelenting passion to see more women ascend politically is really driven by my own experience being white trafficked as a young woman, the sexual abuse I experienced growing up. And I warned my colleagues here at the table that I'd probably cry when I saw this was going to be my question, because the many decade-long journey of my own healing its primary hallmark has been forgiveness. Because, and I think there's a difference between forgiveness and handing out an olive branch. And here's the difference in my personal experience. We have to hash through everything we've experienced. We have to own it. We have to experience it. And only then can we truly forgive. But when we do forgive, Bonnie, it's transformative. And I wouldn't be who I am today unless I had been through that process myself.
All right, your thoughts quickly.
It's interesting. I was thinking about it from my seat here in Washington, where we have so much anger and fighting. And I was thinking one thing that we try to talk about at IWF sometimes is that it's not that we all don't want the same. We want everyone to have a good education, good health care, but it's sort of our perceptions of fairness may differ, right? And if you can try to understand someone else's perception of fairness or perception of good or evil, it could be very helpful.
All right, that's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary, and whether you agree or think to the contrary. See you next week.
I'm sorry, but I don't agree with this notion.